Welcome to Psychology 150 General Psychology. This is the presentation for Chapter 1, an Introduction to Psychology. Obviously, if we're going to be talking about the very first things, Introduction to Psychology, the question is, well, what is psychology? Fundamentally, it's the study of mind and behavior. Its origins come from philosophical studies of mind and behavior questions that go back across millennia, back to the ancient Romans and Greeks, and even prior to that. We know of great philosophers throughout the ages thinking of questions about why we behave the way we do, how we think the way we do, how we understand the world the way we do. Psychology became a formalized scientific approach to studying these philosophical questions. The earliest work was mainly physiological, emerging out of the medical sciences and physiology studies. And so the early studies were about reaction time, how we perceive the world visually and with our hearing, senses of touch, and so forth. But it also went into the areas of memory, how we stored our thoughts and learning about everything from new words to visual images and so forth. And this earliest work was done in Europe, mainly in Germany, which was, of course, a huge influential area on all areas of scientific thinking, particularly the natural world thinking in the 1800s, as well as in Scotland and England, though most of the psychology work was in Germany. It spread to America mainly due to students from the United States going to Germany to study in Wilhelm Wundt's classes and in other locations in Germany. So Germany and America served as diverging centers for study, and I say diverging because even though the Americans went to Germany to study, what we learned is that Americans had some different perspectives and therefore tended to go in some different directions after they came back to America. In the late 20th century, during the cognitive revolution, we have a convergence happen. America goes through a period, as we'll talk about later, where it gets rather very involved in a behaviorism perspective, which served us well in many ways, that Europe did not become as enamored with. And then when America began to take a more cognitive approach, that is less about only the overt behaviors that could be viewed, but also trying to infer and understand processes that were happening within the brain that may not be directly observable, something that the Europeans had been focusing on for decades, a convergence of ideas and thinking occurred. So when we talk about the first psychologist, or what many would consider the first psychologist, we're talking about Wilhelm Wundt, the German who did a great deal of work in what was called structuralism. His perspective is if we break down things into their individual pieces, everything from behaviors to thoughts, we would be able to understand how the mind works. He created the first laboratory in psychological research, and we see here a photo of him with researchers. Your book has a different photo of him with researchers. When we come to the United States, we have a student of Wundt's named William James. Now, William James is part of an amazing family. His brother was one of the most important authors in American history. This is him as a very young man in 1865 visiting Brazil in his early 20s, it looks to me, maybe even younger. And I cannot help but think that hipsters have been with us forever, haven't they? He is considered the first American psychology. He comes from a background of philosophy primarily, but could not help but be attracted to this. And he founded the first American psychology laboratory, though his laboratory was not productive in the way of doing a lot of true novel experimental work. It was mostly a demonstration laboratory for students to learn about the nature of psychology. Still, it was an important moment, and many of his students go on to do great things in the development of psychology in the United States. One of the great things about William James is, even though we're talking about someone who starts his career in the late 1800s and goes into the very early 1900s, when you read his writings, they are very fresh feeling. He was a modernist from the very start, and so his writing is direct, it's clear, and many of his thoughts about how people behaved, how people thought, turned out to be prescient in terms of what we've learned in the decades since. He was very much a very clear thinking person, even if he was not a great experimentalist. Of course, we can't have a discussion about psychology without mentioning Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was a huge figure in Europe and in the United States, throughout most of the Western world in the early parts of the 20th century. Freud dominated because of his own promotion of himself, but also because his ideas were both controversial and inherently intriguing. A lot of the intrigue, the interest amongst the public was because he was talking about things that were kind of taboo to talk about, things about our history and way we were brought up and raised by our parents, and most importantly, talking about sex. And that would be something that would definitely, and did then and still does today, captures people's interest. So he's a highly influential person. This, of course, is a picture of him on the Time magazine, a drawing actually, Time magazine in 1924. He has many books that he wrote: A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis, where he talks about psychotherapy. He has books on dream analysis and so forth. Now, the key thing to know about Freud before we move on is, as notable as he was, and what we know for sure is the way he framed his ideas were, in general, impossible to test. They had what we call a lack of falsifiability to them, the inability for us to be able to imagine data that could disprove his ideas. And that's a major failing in any theory. All theories must have built within them the capability of data being gathered that could show, well, this theory is wrong. If a theory can always be right, it's really not a scientific theory. And most of Freud's ideas were along those lines. Nevertheless, he talked about things such as the unconscious, the importance of our history framing how we view current events, and so forth, which do form a perspective that we have refined and modified into falsifiable theories in the modern era that helps us to understand human thinking, human behavior, and so forth much better. Rising onto the scene in the 19 teens and 20s is John B. Watson. He's a behaviorist, arguably the first behaviorist, coins the term behaviorism. He felt that it was impossible for us to ever know the workings within the mind, and therefore our main perspective should always be about what do we see people and animals do. What is the behavior? That's the only thing that can be objectively observed from his perspective. And it's not an irrational way to look at things, a very scientific. And in fact, in that sense, by taking that particular perspective rather than Freud's kind of the mysteries that are hidden away within the mind, which was based upon a great deal of speculation, Watson is saying, what can we actually look at? That's what's objective. And so Watson becomes the person who advances the science of psychology in many important ways by having us focus on very good, measurable observations. It turns out this is a very limited way to look at the broad range of behaviors and outcomes and thinking that we can have with people, but it nevertheless was an important phase, not only because of the amount of time it spanned in the history of psychology's early years, but also because of the deep impression it had both within psychology as a scientific field, but also in the general public. Watson was very controversial. He would say things that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he could take any child and turn them into anything from a farm laborer to a master lawyer. All he needed to do was be allowed to use the full range of his classical conditioning skills to do that. And of course, controversially, he did use some of those skills in a series of studies with the infant little Albert. Those studies to this day resonate as controversial and important for us to understand. His lab was at Johns Hopkins University, which is one of the early centers for the study of psychology. And then he moved into advertising after being asked to resign from his professorship. It turned out that he had, shall we say, an indiscretion relationship with one of his students that was a scandal and caused him to have to resign. He goes into advertising. Psychologists working in advertising actually have a very long history, and we'll talk about that more in a future class. Also very, very important in behaviorism is B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner worked in what's called operant conditioning. Watson's work was in classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is different in various ways, as we'll learn when we get to the learning chapter. Now, B.F. Skinner was an incredibly influential person also on the cultural landscape because he, again, made propositions about the nature of his work and how it could improve the human condition. He imagined a utopian world where the use of classical and operant conditioning techniques could ensure that there was never any unfairness, there was always good treatment of people, and everybody had a maximized potential in their life. We still do use his operant conditioning chambers, the Skinner box as it's sometimes called, for research settings to this day. And these are all vital, important techniques that are used to this day. Variations on operant and classical conditions are used to help people with psychological difficulties, especially persons who have phobias about, say, spiders or snakes. Or heights or other things. We know that using techniques that develop out of behaviorism are valuable for helping persons to live more functional lives. So these are very important historical notes that are beneficial to our society to this day. Behaviorism, though, was obviously a limited perspective. And so we have a couple of things that start to happen in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to start shifting us away from it. Several of these people are kind of notable, and one of them is Abraham Maslow. He was a humanist, as we like to say, a person who's focused on the human condition and how we can take human values and maximize our potential. He came up with the widely recognized, you probably have seen this before, hierarchy of needs. Your book has a different version of this, and it basically says that once we've satisfied basic physiological safety needs of having a house and food and water and this kind of thing, that we then move on to needs that are less necessary for day-to-day living, but more enhancing of our inherent humanity, belonging and being part of things that are with others, that are greater than ourselves, a building of a sense of self-worth and self-esteem, that we love and admire ourselves, and then self-actualization, when we somehow maximize our potential. There are many things to criticize about Maslow's perspective. One of the main ones is that it doesn't tend to be very predictive when we get down to it of everyday behavior. But its accessibility tends to orient people to their thinking about seeking their best or ideal self, which has some positive value even if its research base is not very solid. Then move on to Carl Rogers, also a humanist, and he developed what we refer to nowadays as client-centered therapy. It's a method that still is very influential in clinical settings. Some of the basic ideas behind client-centered therapy is that individuals should be treated with what we call unconditional positive regard. They should be encouraged to be open, that all things you might say or need to say in therapy are fine and should be said. And the idea of giving that person support to help them find their true potential, referring again to the humanism kind of ideas of finding maximum human potential, that he viewed that as the essential job of the psychotherapist. Now, what we know about these things is it's still valuable even to this day, that these kinds of approaches, even though we use some very different techniques in the clinical setting, that fundamental aspects of being receptive to your client and encouraging them to take a perspective of finding their best self are still vital to a successful client and therapist interaction. Some might term this view, his client-centered therapy view, as somehow creating the ideal parent for the person that is in therapy. We then enter also, coming along kind of parallel to humanism on the more scientific and less applied or therapeutic side, is what we call the cognitive revolution. Now, Ulrich Neisser is the person who kind of formalizes this area by his cognitive psychology textbook that was written in the 1950s and was used for decades after that. Ulrich Neisser was brilliant and pushed us to think in terms of going beyond simply the behaviors we see. What are the processes underlying those behaviors? When we take in information from the world, how do we then process that, store it, recover it, and then use it in a productive way? And so all of those behind the scenes, hidden within the brain processes, he argued very, very effectively could be studied. And he was one of many, many persons who pushed these ideas, and they became the foundation of much of modern psychology. When we look at psychology in many other areas, developmental psychology, social psychology, and clinical psychology, all of them are informed by the advances that were made in cognitive psychology through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Another huge figure in the cognitive revolution was Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky was a linguist. Of course, linguistics is the study of human language and how it's transformed through the generations across the ages. But another job of the linguist is to understand how we produce language as individuals and what are some of the actual mechanics of it. And at a certain level, that's a behavior. But behind that behavior is necessarily a brain. And Chomsky really was focused on the fact that there's got to be developmental aspects of it. In fact, Chomsky is the one who recognizes and promotes the idea that infants make sounds that they never use in their own language. And what they're doing by listening to their parents is pruning away the sounds they don't actually need to make for the language they're learning. He's saying that infants are built to learn language, and all they're doing in their social situation is deciding what is the needed stuff, the needed building blocks for constructing language. And then they learn the linguistic rules, the syntax rules, and all the rest that then enables a child to develop this thing called language, which is a universal in his view. He is a philosopher, a cognitive scientist. He even dabbles in areas of artificial intelligence and so forth. This man is what some might refer to as a polymath. You may not have heard that term, but it is a word that means someone who studies everything and studies it all well. A dabbler is someone who studies everything but doesn't necessarily study it all well. But a polymath is someone who is excellent at many things. He is still to this day a noted social activist. Even after this past Christmas, he was in the news for comments he made about the recent political elections in the United States. He is, as I understand it, emeritus faculty. That means retired faculty at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he spent his entire career. He is what we would call a vital force in pushing the cognitive revolution because of his seeing relevance of it in a wide variety of other areas and his willingness to be outspoken. Of course, we have a lot of other important advances that are coming along in parallel. The biological sciences were advancing tremendously during the 20th century, and today advancing so fast we can barely keep up. And we learned a lot about certain basic physiological and biological processes and having to do with brain chemistry, the structure of the brain, the structure of the elements of the brain such as neurons and how they're built and what the various functions within the neurons are, how they communicate with each other and so forth. And biological psychologists are those who study these physiological and biological aspects of the body and of the brain in particular and nervous system to try to understand how and what is involved in leading to specific thoughts and behavior. Because when you get down to it, everything that we study that's psychological is also biological. that in the end, everything we do, everything we think, what I'm doing right now with my mouth moving and making words that you're hearing, and the listening you're doing as you listen to this presentation, it's all happening in that hunk of meat in our head. We are physiological, biological entities that are able to study ourselves. From a philosophical perspective, it's very cool. We also want to understand, when we're talking about cognitive psychology, sensation and perception, and we want to briefly touch on this because it can be kind of fun. Your book has one version of the duck-rabbit illusion. The sensory information in the illusion is the exact same, no matter which way you see it. You see it as a duck, you see it as a rabbit. And there are many versions of this if you go online and look for them. And you see this version, which is a full body version, which I found remarkably cool. And of course, you can make a joke out of these things if you so choose. A vital force in developmental psychology was Jean Piaget's work with children, discovering the various stages of cognitive development. Stage theories are very, very important, and his was one of the first ones. What he was doing was recognizing that there are certain fundamental concepts that have to be understood by an infant before they can be used for more advanced processing by a toddler, an older child, before they can be used by a still older child, leading eventually to the ability to do abstract reasoning, which is kind of difficult. And so his work was very, very important in recognizing the changes we go through in our childhood. Since then, we've come to recognize other areas of development that parallel, to a certain extent, take advantage of the cognitive development aspects, such as Kohlberg's moral development system and others. And these are important, but they also tend to create a false sense of a locked march forward, when in actuality most of our development is a few steps forward, a little bit of regression or plateauing before we move forward again. Personality psychology is an area that has a rich history because of our fascination with our tendency to see people as unchanging over time, and to a certain extent there's some truth there. But the most curious thing to me about personality psychology is how it tends to generate precious little really, really good outcomes. And so I am personally a little bit negative about personality psychology. Well, that said, there is one area of personality psychology, one development that happened starting about 30 years ago, that is the five-factor model, as it's sometimes called. Your book refers to it as the ocean model. You'll also see it referred to as the canoe model, and you'll also see it referred to as the NEO-PI, the Neo personality inventory. All of these are referring to the same thing. They're recognizing that there's five dimensions of personality: consciousness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, and openness. And persons are not either or on these dimensions. That is, you're not either open or not open. They're scored more like on a scale, like weight is. You're not, while we have points where we say you're overweight, you're obese, you're thin, you're underweight, and so forth, the fact of the matter is you're actually measured in pounds, and even to the tenths and hundredths of a pound. In the same sense, you get a score on openness, a score on conscientiousness, a score on extroversion, and so forth. And so persons are along a dimension of relatively not open to experiences to very, very open to experiences, very, very introverted to very, very extroverted, very variable, very disagreeable to very agreeable, very stable versus very neurotic. In fact, what's curious is neuroticism is the only negatively valenced term in it, and you'll sometimes see versions of this that instead of saying neuroticism has the fifth one labeled as stability or emotional stability, the idea is to have them all be positively valenced. Now, persons can be high on all or some, a few of these, or none of them. And so what they're doing is painting kind of a picture of you that is representative of your relative highs and lows in terms of your style of being a person. What we do know about this is that it tends to correlate well with actual behaviors. It's unusual when it comes to personality work, because personality tends to be an area that is based on theories, many of which come from psychoanalysis and psychotherapeutic models, that then a theory is created from. This is one of where there's also some models that emerge from asking people questions about how they think, and then using various mathematical techniques to create a set of clustered concepts that go together. And there's no theory behind this. It just is. And what's remarkable is all the ones that are theoretical tend to be poor predictors of people's behavior, whereas this one tends to be a pretty good predictor of people's behavior. By the way, just a note here, you probably almost certainly heard of, say, the Myers-Briggs type inventory. Myers-Briggs is not very good at all. You should basically avoid it. Anytime someone brings up the Myers-Briggs, especially if it's at work or something, smile, take the test, listen to what they tell you, and then throw it out when you leave the room, because it's really not very good at all. Social psychology is an area of psychology that emerges after World War II, though it has origins long before that. But it really becomes a powerful, powerful thing after World War II, because World War II had a lot of things happening that people were rather, well, amazed that people could do, particularly obedience to authority. Stanley Milgram specifically wanted to understand why people obeyed and did heinous things in Nazi Germany. So he created a shock machine. And he would have people shock other people to high levels, or at least that's what they thought they were doing. They were not actually shocking anybody. And so what he found is if you create the right situation, a situation where someone with authority says the blame is on me and not on you, and just follow my orders and everything will be fine, no matter what the other person does, no matter how much they're screaming or crying in the other room, keep shocking them. And people will tend to do it. And so we leads us to a fundamental concept of social psychology that is shown in study after study after study after study, that people will behave in a way consistent with situational demands, that almost all of us will, that personality and our backgrounds and religions and all the rest are not nearly as predictive of our behavior as the power of the situation. There are many applied areas of psychology. I'm going to mention two. I'm actually going to mention a third that occurs to me as I sit here, though I didn't prepare the slide with it. Clinical psychology is the classic area that so many people think of as psychology and the psychologist. This is the area where people are getting help from problems they have, some of which are causing them great dysfunction in life, and some of which may be causing them less, but nevertheless they desire to function at a higher level. We've learned over the years that one particular area of therapy tends to be particularly powerful, and this is cognitive behavioral therapy. They take advantage of our knowledge of cognitive processes that we've developed over the decades and behavioral techniques, and they try to help a person see what kind of thoughts and behaviors and situations are causing them difficulty, how to have emotional reactions that are more consistent and more proportional to the actual events going on, how to reframe their viewing of a situation so that they don't see it as catastrophic, they see it in a more realistic fashion, and maybe even a more optimistic fashion, and then also how to have behaviors that put them in safer and more functional situations and recognizing outcomes better. Industrial and organizational psychology is an important area because it's the psychology of the workplace, and we really do want to try to maximize our productivity, at least in the United States, but Europe is also very big on this, where we want to try to have people be happy, healthy, and working well in the workplace. We don't want workplaces to be drudgery areas, though they often are. We want to make good decisions about people in terms of hiring, promotion, and all the rest, and that's what the IO psychologist does. Starting in fall 2017, we're going to have a minor in industrial and organizational psychology at Frostburg State. And so a student of any major on Frostburg State's campus is eligible to take the IO minor. So I want to encourage you to look at it. And if you have questions about it, please do send me an email and I will let you know. We believe that adding this dimension of person factors with business awareness will be helpful for any degree that someone gets, because almost anything you're going to do in a career, whether it be as a writer, as an artist, as a musician, as a biologist, as a geologist, and so forth, you are going to be working in some kind of work environment where you have groups and teams of people and making decisions about who is being productive, who's getting the job done, and who's not. And knowing what you can do to make better decisions and use better thinking on that can't help but be good for anyone in any job. That's why we've created this. And FSU is unique on this as well. So what can you do with a psych degree? The old joke is you get a psych degree and then you got to go to grad school. And yeah, it's not exactly untrue. If you want to be someone that wants to go into counseling or clinical psychology, if you want to be sitting in sessions with people, hearing their deep, difficult problems and how to help them manage those problems, sometimes with life or death consequences or the possibility of injury to self or others, you do need to be extremely highly trained. And that's why we expect persons to have a master's or doctorate degree. But with a bachelor's degree, there's still a lot of areas where a person can use that degree. A psychology major gets an education not only in the myriad aspects of understanding we have of what motivates behavior, what influences behavior, how to improve people's behavior, actions, and work processes, but it also and how we can be better involved with children, how to listen better, how to communicate better, and so forth. But it also helps persons to have more critical thinking minds, because we expose students to a lot of wacky theories and wacky ideas and show them why they're wacky. We have research methods classes that are strongly science oriented and based, where we understand the various ways we can have knowledge we can that we know is where we develop knowledge that we know is valid and useful. And also we have statistics and mathematics classes in the major that are important for understanding how to work with numbers and how to make good decisions with numbers. Because something I like to say is there's either people who know how to do math or don't know how to do math. And the difference between them is this: the people who don't know how to do math are working for the people who do know how to do math. The people who do know how to do math invariably rise to the top. We are an information society. We are a quantitative society. The person that knows how to make the best decisions based upon the best information with good critical thinking and good critical and often numerical analysis is the one that has the best opportunities. And so we see a variety of jobs, from social work to rehabilitation specialists, copywriters, because of the work we do with helping people learn how to write, being an assistant in development in a school or care situation, helping with market research, persons who are in sales, teachers, public relations, people who work in human resources are commonly seen coming from psychology majors, especially if they've done some work in IO psychology. And we also know that persons for the bachelor's degree in psychology can work as research assistants in laboratories, helping to gather data, manage the studies, and keep things organized. And so there's a lot of good work to be done by persons with a bachelor's degree beyond and besides being someone who is involved in the work of helping people with their difficulties. That's important work, but it's not the only work that's valuable to do with what we learn in psychology. For instance, myself, I am not trained as a clinician. I am not a counseling person. My work is in social psychology and educational psychology. I'm a specialist in measurement, research, statistics, and social psychology concepts of group affiliation and the effects those have on certain kinds of behavior. So, going forward, make sure you do your quizzes. You got 2 reasons to do your quizzes in this class. First, you want to score your points towards the letter grade, obviously. You want to get your score. But the next thing is practice and learning towards exams. We know that a person learns through what we call the testing effect. It's an extremely powerful, beneficial effect. The various questions within the chapters of the textbook that are built in help you to elaborate on information, but also help you to recall it. Doing these quizzes multiple times will cause you to do recall after recall after recall, and when you make an error, you can look it up and make sure you understand better, so the next time you take it, you will recall better. That's how we reinforce learning. You do not reinforce learning by rereading multiple times. You've probably done that method in classes and had it not work so well. But testing and practice with the material does work. Also, make sure you stay on time in this class. Don't get behind. There's a schedule listed that is not do this by this due date, but this is the schedule you need to be on if you want to make the grade you hope to make. I wish you well on that. Stay in touch with me, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, and goodbye.